Okay, welcome everyone. It's 5:30 p.m, so we will commence the meeting. Welcome to the Special Council meeting for Monday the 28th of February 2022. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on bungalow land and we give thanks for use of that land. Just bear with me one moment. That other information. There we go. Thank you. I've got it. Apologies for that. So, right. As per our normal online procedures, I would like to welcome everyone to the live streaming tonight for our Special Council meeting 28th of February 22. Just before we begin, I must provide some useful information for tonight's meeting to our community members attending this virtual council meeting. By joining us tonight using Microsoft Teams, we have provided you with the link to Microsoft's privacy statement and on our agenda page. Tonight you are a guest and you will see that next to your name now that you have joined the meeting. Please note this meeting is being recorded, and by remaining online you acknowledge that you're aware of the recording and accept this as a condition of connecting to the meeting. We share this recording along with the minutes to each meeting with the Whyalla community on our website and through our social media. As per local government meeting regulations, members of the gallery are not permitted to speak during a council meeting, so as our guest, your camera and microphone have been disabled. Any listed confidential items will be heard in a Microsoft Teams breakout room away from the main virtual meeting room. The council meeting administrator will continue to monitor the special council meeting room and public access to this meeting. Should a conflict of interest arise for a member of council, a separate Microsoft Teams breakout room has been created. Council meeting administrators will assist all meeting room transfers and also assist guests to exit the meeting if required. Once again, thank you for joining us for our live stream meeting. We ask for your patience as we continue to work through any technical challenges that may arise. Okay, so we now go to item 2, attendance records. I think Councillor Pond will be joining us soon, but everybody else is in attendance, so thank you for that. Leave of absences, there are none. Item 3, declarations of members' conflict of interest. Do any councillors have them? Can they please make me aware of them now? Okay, I take that there is none. Thank you. Item 4, reports from council officers. There are nil. Item 5, considerations of confidential items. We have 5.1.1, the Regional Development Australia Eyre Peninsula Incorporated Whyalla Council funding, and this is a confidential item. So now I would ask that I have a mover and a seconder to take us into confidence for this item's discussion. Can I have someone please move that? Thank you, David. Councillor Knox, seconded Councillor Westerman. Thank you. I'll have a show of hands. All those in favour? Thank you. So we are now in moving into confidence, and we'll just wait a moment while the staff sort out the Teams rooms. Thank you. And I will let you know when we can commence the discussions. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to our normal meeting room. Thank you. Okay, so that's the end of our special council meeting. I'd like to acknowledge that it has closed at 5:59 p.m. I'll now allow a 5-minute break. Go and do what you need to do and come back, and then we'll start the briefing session under the guidance of the CEO. Thank you.
So I'd now like to open the elected member briefing for the 28th of February. I'd like to welcome everyone who's online and thank you for joining us tonight for the live stream of this elected member briefing. Before I begin, or we begin, I should say, I'd like to provide some information about tonight's meeting. Anyone from the community who's attending us via the virtual means through Microsoft Teams, you've been provided the ability to come into this meeting, but as guests only, so you won't be able to participate in the discussion. As with council meetings, if we need to deal with any items of a confidential nature, and we will be tonight, we will vacate the public meeting space and go into a confidential room, and our administration will assist with the process for councillors to be consider those items of that they need to in confidence. Once we finish the confidential items, we'll return back to the public forum where the recording will continue. Just remind everyone that's online that we're still in the early days of using live streaming, so please ask for your patience as we work through any technical challenges that may arise tonight. And with that, I will now like to open with an acknowledgement that we meet tonight on the traditional lands of the traditional owners, the Whyalla people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and those that are emerging. All right, so we'll get into the discussion for tonight, noting that tonight is not a formal council meeting, so it's not a formal decision-making forum. The first item that we will consider tonight is in relation to Qantas, a deputation from Qantas. So I'm going to ask, even though it's not a formal meeting, just a show of hands from councillors to go into confidence to deal with or to receive the presentation. So that will be under section 90, subsection 3 of the Local Government Act. Can I just get an indication from councillors that they're happy to go into confidence? Thank you, councillors. If we can just ask for the councillors and the deputies from Qantas just to sit tight. We'll go into a confidential breakout room. For anyone else who's online, we'll return back to this meeting, public meeting forum, once we've dealt with this confidential item. So please bear with us. Okay, welcome back, councillors and staff. If I can get someone to send a message to Kristen Clark to also resume this meeting, please. But we'll kick off, and Kristen will join us shortly as well.
Yeah, that's occurring.
Okay. All right, so we'll move now on to the second item of business, which is in relation to the budget discussion and the annual business plan and budget. I'll just share my screen. Just bear with me. Just quickly get it. Okay, councillors, hopefully you can see Grant's desktop. My computer decided to go slow at the wrong time. Okay, so just going to walk through some information. This really is the start of the process regarding our annual business plan and budget discussions for 2022-23. What I wanted to do tonight in kicking off the process is to, at a glance, revisit our city, our services, reflect on what we've achieved in recent times, have a look at what the current operating environment looks like, then start to put our mind to what 22-23 might look like in terms of services, projects and priorities. Anchor that conversation around our strategic planning framework and the current budget parameters, and then look at the funding options to be able to deliver services. I'm probably going to talk a little bit up front, try to get through a fair bit of content reasonably quickly, just to set the context and then open it up for questions. But as I do go through, if any questions do come to mind, please, councillors, either use the chat function or call out. So if we just, some of this material will be familiar to you. It's we use some of this collateral as part of the consultation with the community last year. So we've got our city at a glance. Sorry, go back to. Councillors will be familiar with this infographic. It just shows where we are, who we are, and some background information. So that won't be new to you. At a glance, all of our services. Again, this graphic is the same as what we used last year. So pretty much like most local governments, councils, we provide a very diverse range of services, and probably just to highlight, in addition to what many councils deliver as what you might call core business for councils in terms of library services, public amenities and the like, we have some additional services that we provide as a council here, including our airport, childcare centre, a cemetery and crematorium, visitor information centre, and a couple of jetties to boot. So there's certainly plenty of services that we deliver to our community. In terms of the just reflecting on what we've been doing of late and our recent achievements, this is the report that went up to the council meeting last week, which confirmed our mid-year review of our achievement of the annual business plan in the current year and the delivery against council's strategic plan objectives. You will recall from the discussion at the last council meeting, most of the projects are on track. We have had some minor delays, and we'll talk about what has given rise to some of those delays in recent times, and then only one or two that we're struggling to deliver on. So as I said, I won't labour through that because you saw that report at the last council meeting. In terms of just thinking about the operating environment that we've got, that we're in now, and what we can foresee over the next 12 months or so, councillors will be very mindful that we have state and federal government elections this year. That presents an opportunity in terms of putting forward our priorities to the state and federal governments, and to look to establish partnerships and relationships with both the state and federal government in terms of the services and the projects that are delivered in our city and our region over the coming years. I think it's worth noting that over recent years there has been an improved relationship between the city of Whyalla and the state government in particular, and I think the relationship with the federal government, albeit it's a little bit further removed, is very positive as well. Later this year we have local government elections, so need to be mindful of that. One of the things that we'll talk about through this budget process is what are the services or projects that you would like to see delivered in next year's budget, which obviously will include the lead up to the next elections. We have the local government reform. Again, keep emphasising that we shouldn't underestimate the implications and the impost on council associated with that reform. It's the most significant reform to local government legislation for many years, probably back to the 1990s, and the amalgamations of council was probably the last significant reform of local government. We will all be mindful of the increased cost of living. The current CPI is running at 3.3%, higher than what we probably anticipated 12 months or so ago. And with the major stimulus that is occurring across federal, state and local councils in terms of capital projects and particularly infrastructure projects, we are now starting to see increasing costs and increasing timeframes to be able to access materials and also service providers. We've got a number of major developments on the immediate horizon, and certainly those have flavoured the election priorities with a very clear focus on hydrogen capabilities being built in our region. We expect, hopefully within the next month or two, confirmation from the federal government that the state government will have received some funding to support the private sector investment at Port Bonython. Obviously, GFG continues to make investments both in their mining operations and their steelworks, and council's been had received some information about some of those investments in recent times, and then the hotel proposed for the foreshore area again is on the horizon. Last year, we talked about some of the challenges that we have as a council and the legacy issues, and we spent some time working through and starting to document those legacy issues. And one of the KPIs that council set for myself for the current financial year is to have a plan for how we can address those legacy issues over coming years, noting that it will take us a number of years to work through some of those matters. We also talked about, as an elected member group, what are some of the priorities and things that we want to achieve again in the foreseeable future. Through those discussions, we talked about the need to improve our organisation's capabilities, and we've talked about organisational structure and building some extra capability, particularly at our within our management level, so third level of the organisation, to build our capabilities internally. And we note one of the key challenges for us going forward is in relation to our systems, and we've identified as one of the priorities system modernisation. In more recent times, we've had the discovery process ongoing in terms of some of the challenges with the civic building that we currently reside in. We have just recently received a couple of the reports that we're waiting on, so we're getting pretty close to being able to come back to council with some detailed information about what it's going to cost to extend the remaining life in the existing building versus some other options. So getting close to being able to bring that back to council for consideration. I've already touched on some of the supply issues, particularly around infrastructure projects. We have been experiencing, and we're not orphans in this regard, an increase in cost associated with some of the contracts to get services delivered in region. And it's not just a challenge within region, even metropolitan councils are now starting to find the cost of capital infrastructure is increasing because of the demand or load that is on the system at present. Some cost pressures. Councillors will be ever mindful of the increasing costs associated with the EPA licence and the waste to landfill levies that we collect, and probably not probably to the same extent, but very shortly we'll share with you some of the increased costs that we've had associated with some of our major sporting ovals. Obviously, with increasing service levels, with the upgrade of the Bennett Oval and Memorial Ovals in recent times, that will contribute to increased maintenance costs. But we've also had some issues with vandalism, and most recently with some cockies starting to acquire the taste of some of the electrical cabling for the lighting at the ovals, which is going to cost us a bomb to fix. And lastly, we've got the challenges of COVID and everything that COVID presents in terms of attracting people to regions, travel, cost of goods and services, and the like. So maybe just before I move off that slide, that's a pretty quick sort of skim of some of the things within the operating environment. Have any councillors want to add to that list? It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but we think we've caught the big items. But have we missed any obvious ones that councillors want to remind us of? If not, we'll keep moving. All right, so that's a bit of a reflection on where we've come from and where we're at present. If we then turn our mind to what are we trying to achieve for the future, and to deliver on council's strategic plan. Again, some of these slides will be familiar to councillors, given that again it was part of the same discussion we had last year. There will be a continuation of services, so things like airport services, events, library services, maintenance of the HMS Whyalla, all those things we're planning to continue. So the budget has been framed on the basis of a business as usual, or no sort of changes without a conscious decision of council. So we've factored in the increasing costs associated with continuing services, and off the back of the last session we had, obviously the cost of running an airport with full screening in place is going to create some cost pressures that we need to be mindful of. So continuing the current services is one thing that we're looking to do. We then have our city projects. So council, as part of the 21-22 budget year, looked at a number of, we call them city building or city projects. So things like the Whyalla Foreshore Precinct, the Northern Coastline project, upgrades to the Recreation and Leisure Centre. Those things council has already considered as part of this year's budget, and essentially a number of those projects have got a couple of years life in them. So to a large extent, we've probably committed some of our forward capital works projects to those, a number of those projects already, which means that we're left with not a lot to spend on other projects. And through the budget deliberations over the coming weeks, council will be able to revisit how much we spend on the different projects that we've got on the radar, noting that some are already locked in. So the Northern Coastline implementation, for example, that's essentially already committed with 50% funded from the state government. So it will be difficult to turn back some of those decisions, but other decisions will be clearly for council to make that call in terms of the staging of works going forward. Next slide. Just again, want to remind councillors, and we'll do so with the community in due course, when we talk about delivering local government services, very much at the heart of the narrative is around the livability of our city. The councillors will be familiar with this slide. We need to be mindful that regional centres can get to a point where if they shrink too much, it's then difficult to be able to provide the full breadth of services associated or that are needed to encourage people to want to work and live in the region. Foreshadowing the conversation that we'll have later in tonight's discussion, one of the challenges that we have within South Australia is that we don't have regional centres or regional cities of huge state significance here compared to other councils, and it's something that I think we need to challenge both the federal government and state government, particularly in the context of hydrogen hubs and the like. And as per council's election priorities, in order to attract the workforce needed to support that private sector investment and public sector investment into significant new industry and business coming into our area, we also need significant investment into the facilities, amenity services that are provided in our city to attract people to our city. So livability is at the heart. Livability will mean something to different people. On the slide here is some of the words that different people associate with livability. Again, this won't be unfamiliar to council, and the challenge ultimately for all of us, the royal we, not only individual councillors and the organisation, but our broader community, business community, other key stakeholders like state and federal government, is how do we think like a community and not as an individual when we look at the decision making before us. If I can then go to the next slide, probably as a sort of foreshadowing the discussion, I think it will probably be to no surprise to councillors that our budget challenge is a difficult one. The councillors previously have set a KPI to return the organisation to a balanced position by the year 26-27. So we're certainly doing some work with the administration at present, looking at delivering some options for council's consideration in terms of how we might achieve that outcome. Just on this board or slide at present, again, probably not for critical analysis at this point in time, it's more just for context setting. This is a list of priorities that are currently not included in the current budget model that we're going to present to you shortly. So you can see, bottom line, there's a significant amount of projects or things that we believe that we could be doing or should be doing, which currently at administrative level have not been included in the budget. Ultimately, that will be for councillors to make the determination about what's in and what's not in the budget. But just wanted to flag that even before we start looking at what our current budget situation looks like, there are a reasonable amount of expenditure that's not been factored into the budget. If I can turn to the next slide, again, just a reminder that setting the budget is not done in isolation. This is our strategic framework. It's an infographic that shows how the community, public, provide us input into our planning. We have our strategic plan that has been, we've did some consultation on a couple of years ago. Post local government elections will be time to revisit the strategic plan. But that strategic plan then informs or is underpinned by other plans, including our long-term financial plan, our asset management plan, and ultimately council decides each year what gets included in its annual business plan and budget, which we go out and consult with the community on. So there's essentially a constant feedback loop to the community to get the community input to inform council's decision making. Through the process internally, we have organisational values, and we need to put in place systems and have the resources in place to deliver on the customer experience or deliver the customer services, and ultimately we get feedback from the community as to whether we're delivering on their needs and their aspirations through typically annual community surveys, which again at the last council meeting we provided some feedback regarding the last survey done, and that will help again inform the decision making of council as we move into considering next year's budget. Again, I might just do a quick pause before we then start talking about budget parameters. Any questions from councillors so far. I know I'm speaking fast and just trying to get through a fair bit of content, and then we'll open it up for a conversation shortly. Councillor Knox, question or comment?
Just one quick comment. You'd be surprised if I didn't say this, but in the projects, there's no mention of the walking trail bike track linking the hills that was moved on council 7 years ago.
Yeah, so that last list was definitely not an exhaustive list, and that was a list of things that are currently not included. And I'll be pleased to confirm again, Councillor Knox, that we are looking at getting some work done in terms of getting those that pathway and the linkages in place, and that will be one of the items for council to consider as part of the budget process. Okay. So if we move on to then the budget parameters, these are the parameters that were set by council previously. So just reminding the councillors that this is our starting point as administration in terms of working up the draft budget for consideration. So obviously everything we do needs to help support achieve outcomes as listed in council's strategic plan. We are actively looking at addressing issues and opportunities as we look at how we improve our organisational effectiveness and efficiency through various reviews, so service reviews, audit reviews and the like. We have the objective of reaching a break-even operating position by the year 2026-27 or earlier. We are looking at improving our whole of life management of our assets and the intervention plans associated with managing our assets in line with the asset management strategy, with a priority on ensuring that we that all assets reach their end of life. I think we've probably achieved that, actually overachieved that. I think some of our assets are probably past end of life. And the question then is, what do we do with some of those assets? And I'll mention, for example, we've got a lot of buildings that are currently owned by council that are no longer delivering any service to the community. Just pulling one as an example, the Apex building. I believe that's currently sitting there, not being used at all, but it's still on our books as an asset that we need to maintain. The question is, if now that's at end of life, what do we do with that asset? But we'll deep dive into that shortly. We aim to ensure that we have 100% funding on renewal to ensure that our assets do continue to deliver service to end of life. We'll continue to review existing services and assets to ensure they meet prioritised community needs. Again, that will be one of the key roles for council, is to help define what those community needs are and to ensure that we've got the right services and service levels to meet those needs. Council will only approve new or upgrade capital projects where it's been identified that we have the borrowing capacity to fund upfront capital costs, and also the ability to maintain those assets over the longer term in terms of the ongoing operating and maintenance costs associated with those assets. And lastly, we want to maintain the predictability and stability of rating increases over the longer term, so we don't have rates jumping around from year to year, giving that uncertainty in terms of the rate increase. In terms of our funding, again, similar slide to what we used last year. On the left-hand side, we've got how much funding goes towards different initiatives. And then on the right-hand side, what the components of the rate increase is. With the increase in CPI, so currently it's one of our budget parameters in the past was to have rates increased by CPI plus 1.5%, 1.9%, sorry. I've got Grant in my room. That was the budget parameter we worked on previously. CPI is currently running at 3.3. So if we apply that, we're looking at a rate increase of close to 5%, allowing 1% for projects, 0.4% for local government price increases, and then 0.2% to help service our borrowing requirements. So, all things being equal, we're currently looking at an increase of rates of about 5%, all things being equal, and emphasising today is the start of the process. Through the process, council will need to make a call as to whether you want to increase that or decrease that rate increase, noting that it will be about balancing the capacity of the community to pay with the requirements in terms of the service levels and the cost of delivering services. Move to the next slide. Some of the updated assumptions that we've applied in the first iteration of the draft budget, which will show you what that looks like at present. So in line with what I just said, we've assumed that the CPI figure will be 3.3, given that that's the most recently announced CPI figure at our disposal. That figure, I think, if you watch all of the forecasts, is expected to increase, but we hope only marginally in the short term. It'll be interesting to see with employment rates, unemployment rates, and with state and federal government elections and budgets before us, which direction CPI heads, but I think it's probably anticipated to increase over time. The next item is around the organisational realignment. So the draft budget that we've started with in the current year has got an increase of 9% over the previous assumption. So council will remember a couple of years ago that you increased the budget with an increase in number of FTEs for 1 year, with the expectation that FTEs would then decrease in future years. With the discussion we had through last year, we need to revisit that assumption in terms of our organisational numbers and the underlying cost of service delivery. So we have included the 9 FTEs, and that looks like a large number, but remembering it's coming from the base set a couple of years ago. So we've factored that 9 FTE in, which adds an extra $1.2 million into our operating costs over previous assumptions, and we'll obviously need to work through what does that mean in terms of rates and service levels. And then the last assumption that we've updated is in relation to airport passenger income, and we've had to push back by 1 year our assumptions in terms of the number of passenger movements coming back online. And again, off the back of the Qantas presentation we just had, things are still a bit soft, and the numbers are not coming back online as quickly as maybe some people had hoped or wished. If we, with those updated assumptions, and we'll come back and talk to those, I just want to get to the next slide, which is probably where we need to get to in terms of the starting point. So our current long-term financial plan, looking at the draft budget at present and what the 10-year looks like. On this slide, there's essentially 3 tables. The top table includes a combination of both the council's operations as well as the airport. So a consolidated position with both council and airport operations included. The middle table is airport in isolation, and the bottom table is council services in isolation. So in simple terms, the top table is just the sum of the bottom 2. If I just pick out a couple of numbers just to orientate the councillors in terms of what you're looking at. If I look at the year 1 figures, 2023, so there's a couple of blue highlighted figures there. Starting at the bottom, and working up, our current draft budget sees an operating deficit of 1.6 mil with those budget assumptions that have just been applied. But prior to any councillor input in terms of prioritisation and discussion about rates and the like, our airport is currently looking at a deficit of 761,000. So the sum of those two shows that in year one we've got a consolidated deficit projected to be 2.3 million as our starting point. If we look out 5 years and to the time horizon that council indicated it wanted to achieve a balanced operating result, again starting at the bottom, currently we're projecting a $1.8 million deficit, so we're $1.8 million off the mark in terms of where we need to be in a 5-year time frame. The airport is still looking at an operating deficit to the tune of about $500,000 in 2027, giving us a consolidated deficit of about 2.3 mil. So that's our starting point for conversations in relation to this year's budget, and just kick off the process. So I'll probably stop there. First, just ask for any initial comments. Obviously, we're not providing the detail for councillors tonight to start wading through. What we wanted to do is get your initial reactions to some of those assumptions that we've adjusted, what the current forecasts look like. We have got some options that we can consider in terms of where we could potentially look to reduce our operating costs. So we certainly have a lot of thinking and work going on behind the scenes, but really just wanted to get council's initial reaction to some of those numbers and some of the those key assumptions that I mentioned previously. Does any council want to kick off? Councillor Knox to start.
My comment is that it would have been better if we'd had all this information before the meeting, so we could have considered it and come back with questions.
Yeah, just to be clear, what we wanted to do was to start the process with a conversation at the highest level. There's a whole heap of detail that obviously sits below this, but we didn't want to put a whole heap of detail in front of councillors that potentially was not going to be value adding in terms of the process of working through it. Except that councillors need the detail, and that for future meetings we'll provide that detail in advance. But I just wanted to, as I said, start at the highest level. If councillors said straight up, 5% rate increase is just not a realistic scenario for whatever reason in the current year, and it should be 3%, then clearly we're going to have to go back and work the numbers really hard. Whereas if you say 5% for all the context we're operating in is a reasonable starting point, let's have a look at the detail premised on a 5% increase, and then we could work through those numbers. So really tonight just wanted to get the initial reaction and indication from councillors, and then we'll certainly come back with the detail and as a group, elected member group, pour through that detail in due course. Councillor Stupos.
I thought the decision was that by 2027 we'll be in a break-even position. This is actually telling us that we're in a loss position still.
Yep, that's correct. So there's a couple of pieces of work that we're working on, which will come to council over the coming weeks. One is to look at the legacy issues. And so one of the KPIs for myself in the current year is to come back with some options in relation to addressing some of those legacy issues. And some of those legacy issues invariably will have cost implications for council. That's number one. Number two council asked for some options for delivering. Sorry, I probably didn't say that right. So the KPI in relation to legacy issues is a program of work, probably over a 10-year period, to address those legacy issues and to document what the packages of work are and what the cost implications are for resolving or closing out those legacy issues. So that's number one. So we're working on that as we speak. Number two is options for council's consideration to deliver an operating surplus by 2027. So again, we're doing some work on that. The starting point will show that we're going to have to make some really difficult decisions to achieve that outcome, and that will come to council for consideration. Those decisions might include anything from either increasing rates, reducing service levels. Obviously, we're actively seeking external funding to help supplement our revenue base, etc. So we'll come back to council with that list. The third piece of work that we're doing significant work on at present, which I think will be part of the solution going forward in terms of reducing our operating spend, is in relation to our building assets. I've sort of foreshadowed before, and councillors are aware, we have a significant number of building assets that are really not fit for purpose in terms of delivering a suitable level of service to the community, and we need to revisit what level of service does council provide to the community in the form of community facilities, and how do we deliver that service. We've got on the 15th of this month, so 2 weeks' time, a detailed workshop with councillors to work through all of our building assets and to do a deep dive into that very question around what buildings do we maintain, which ones do we upgrade, which ones do we look to divest ourselves of through one form or another, and ultimately sitting underneath all of that discussion is what level of service do we want to provide going forward. So long-winded answer, Councillor Stupos, but the answer is yes. Our starting position shows that we've got a significant challenge to get to that desired result that council has set, which is a balanced position by 2027. Any other initial questions or comments from councillors?
No, well, I just wanted to say, I think the additional information will be very useful to all of us. And yeah, I like the idea around the asset management initiatives moving forward. I think that's something that we need to for everyone to know. That's an important opportunity for us to get to a better financial position.
Yep. Councillor Knox.
Promise I'll be quiet after this one. You mentioned that there's an increase of 9 full-time equivalents costing 1,267,000 additional over previous assumption. Can you explain that? I don't quite get it.
Yeah. You happy to answer that one? I might get Grant to respond to this one in the first instance.
So the way that's worded is, so as Justin mentioned, a couple of years ago, there was the decision to increase FTEs by, it was about 8 FTEs and then come back down over a 2-year period, back to the base level from, like 3 years ago. So this, when we modelled out the structure realignment that Justin presented to council last year, that was the difference between that base position from 3 years ago, which the plan had us going back to, and what that restructure model looked like, and so the FTEs and the cost.
I don't get it from that. It's it says this is additional over previous assumptions. So that to me says okay, we've stuffed up.
Well, the assumption, yep. So the assumption was that previously, with that council decision, was that council would move back to the FTE from, it was about 2017-18. And what we're saying is the difference between the realignment that was presented last year and that previous assumption that we would continue to operate on 17-18 FTEs, that's the difference between those two.
Okay, one last comment. It's an average of almost 141,000.
So I might just have one more comment here that's just using nice round numbers for simplicity. So if I said 3 years ago, council made the assumption in terms of FTEs that there would be an increase in year 1 of 8 FTEs, and then over the two following years, that the FTEs would then drop back to the original starting point. So you do +8 in year 1, -4 in year 2, -4 in year 3 to come back to pre-existing FTE numbers. So the organisational realignment that was consulted with both internally and with councillors last year is a 9 FTE increase from that base year 3 years ago. So it's not a 9% increase from last year. It's a 9 FTE increase over effectively an assumption that was built into the budget 3 years ago.
I'll leave it at that. I still don't.
Did you have a supplementary question, Councillor Knox? No. Maybe if I can just turn to the next slide. Again, just emphasising this is the start of the process and it's at the highest level. Grant, you just need to go forward one slide. Just in terms of some of the funding options, some of the things that we can do in terms of adjusting the budget. We have currently an assumption built into the draft budget that shows that for every dollar that we spend on upgrading or new assets, that we apply essentially a loading of 4.5% to the budget to reflect the increased cost of maintaining that asset. So if we use Bennett Oval as an example, when council invested X million dollars in the upgrade of Bennett Oval, we then factored into the ongoing operating budget an increase of 4.5% to cover the increased cost of maintaining that asset. So there is an opportunity potentially to clip that, but noting that if we clip it or reduce that budget allocation, we need to be mindful that we do have sufficient budgets to be able to maintain the assets, because what we don't want to do is build new assets or upgrade assets and then not maintain them, leading to a deterioration in the useful life or the bringing forward the intervention period required for that asset. We could build into the budget an assumption around vacant positions. One of the challenges that this organisation has is that we do have a reasonably high level in relative terms in terms of our natural attrition of staff. So every time we have a staff person leave, it takes us some time to fill that position. So we can factor into the budget essentially a savings associated with the time it takes to fill positions. Noting, however, that we obviously want to actually reduce our natural attrition rate so we don't have as many vacant positions as often. And just on that subject, one of my the other KPIs that council set for myself was to try and actually reduce the turnover of our senior managers. I'm pleased to say that our current executive group have been together on deck as a collective for 12 months, which on reflection in recent history is actually doesn't seem like a long time, but that's actually a positive outcome that we've had our Kathy, Kristen, Jade and myself all on deck now for a 12-month period. Next one is around the building stock. There's a figure in terms of the potential reduction in maintenance costs associated with those assets, and there would also be depreciation. Depending on what rationalisation we do of the building stock, we could potentially extract some more out of that in terms of a saving. But it really comes to council in terms of what buildings do you want to maintain and what service level do you want to provide, and a discussion around how we provision building facilities to support our community. And then lastly, other operating savings. So again, as I've indicated, administratively, we are looking at where there could be some other operating savings, typically tied with some efficiency improvements that we can extract out of our systems and procedures, but noting that it will take us some time to be able to generate those internal efficiencies. And the other savings could be in terms of reduction in services or service levels. So they're just a couple of things that we are looking at. Again, just an initial call out to councillors. Is there any there that you particularly like or don't like, or is there things that are not on that list that you think should be on that list?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I think that we just need to have some time to digest.
And again, you don't need to have the answer today because it's the start of the process, but just again, if there's any initial comments.
Yeah, no, that was my comment, Justin, that we just need some time to digest this information, but appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay, if not, we'll move on to the next slide. So I need 2 more slides for tonight. So in terms of the budget parameters, just revisiting the budget parameters that council set before, this version colour codes those that we're currently achieving or in alignment with. So the light blue coloured, hopefully there's no one that's colourblind. The light blue ones, which are items 1, 2, 4, and 6, we're currently in alignment with. Item number 3, which is red, is clearly one that we're not on the mark at present, and so significant more work is required to deliver on that one. Items 5 and 7, which are in black, are essentially work in progress and are subject to the deliberation through the budget process. And it may take a couple of years. Sorry, did you say?
No, that will be used to make number 3 happen.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. And items 5 and 7 essentially will underpin number 3. So what decisions council makes in relation to 5 and 7 will directly go to the question of how well we can deliver on that third key budget parameter. Again, any just questions or comments from councillors on that one? No, so we'll go to the last slide. So where to from here? Now that we've kicked off the process for our budget deliberations for next year, we've got a number of workshops over the coming weeks. So this is the busy time of year for councillors. So next week, we will deep dive into the operating budget. We'll provide the current capital budget and have a discussion about our rating strategy. And information will come out in advance of that workshop so that councillors will have something to process and consider before the workshop. The following week on the 15th, we'll do the deep dive into the council's buildings and have a detailed conversation around what services are we delivering to the community through our buildings, and how is the most cost efficient way of delivering that service. And that will help inform some further discussions and decisions to follow around our building assets. We'll follow up on previous discussions, and then at this point in time, we've got the 4th of April scheduled for the audit committee to review the draft budget. We may need another workshop or two through the journey, and once we start getting into the details over the next 2 weeks, we'll work out what additional workshops may be required to work us through the detail. Councillor Stupos.
Yeah, Justin, at what stage are we going to go to public consultation with all of this?
Sorry, Councillor Stupos, do you have a question or comments? If so, you're on mute.
No, I'm not. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I heard you.
Yeah, sorry. At what stage are we going to go to public consultation on all of this?
I can answer that one. So currently the audit committee is booked in for 4th of April, and then the budget is meant to go to the April meeting to go out for public consultation later that week. So yeah, 3rd week of April is when it would commence for about a month.
Subject of consultation. Yeah, sorry. Having granted myself in the same room, turning mics and things on and off, a bit tricky. Again, subject to councillor feedback, our plan is to run a similar process to last year in terms of community consultation. So a combination of public forums, focus group meetings, obviously online surveys and the like. So plenty of opportunity for the community to have some input. We got some good feedback from the community and from councillors last year that it was a robust process. This year, also given local government elections later in the year, I'm sure it will be a topical subject, and I'm sure we'll get good community engagement over coming months in terms of the budget and the rates for next year. And council laws will obviously need to think about or be mindful of the fact that the elections will be partway / early into the new financial year, being in November of this year. Are councillors generally pretty comfortable with taking a similar approach to last year in terms of the community consultation and engagement? Councillor Stone?
Thank you, Justin. I'd certainly agree with the system that we had last year. And I guess just a comment from what we've seen tonight, I think it really shows that we have got some big decisions to make. They may not all be popular decisions, perhaps with administration. We've got to get our priorities right, and we've got to explain to the community, even more so than last year, they won't be happy even if we were looking at a 5%. We've got to justify that, not from the point of view of, but we need it to make ends meet, but to explain why we have certain priorities, why our future is going to be very hard over the next few years, and make sure we really do take them along, not just with all the good stories, but some of the issues that we do face ahead. So it's a task for us all to succeed with.
Thank you. Councillor Simpson?
Like as Councillor Stone said, I thought last year's community engagement was very, very good. If we're doing it again this year, it's even better, because they'll be better informed. I think. Yeah.
Maybe, as I like doing, giving councillors some homework, if you can maybe reflect on the consultation and the narrative and the key messages that we took to the community last year, and what you might want to reshape, or maybe what part of the storytelling needs to be amplified. My view was that I think we presented a pretty holistic and balanced and robust narrative around the budget last year, and certainly the feedback that we got through a number of the forums, particularly the likes of the focus group and some of the public meetings, was that the community appreciated and I think better understood some of the challenges that lay before us. So whilst no one likes rate increases, myself included, I think explaining the rationale for the council's budget and the associated rate consideration is something that if councillors do have feedback, happy to receive that offline. Okay. If there's no other questions at this point in time, again, I'll just say that tonight definitely wasn't meant to do the deep diving. So I know some councillors will be frustrating that you're probably itching for the detail. We'll get into the deep diving and into the detail as of next week and start to work through it together. So we'll pause there on this item. Just wanted to check in with councillors. Does everyone want to have just a couple of minute refreshment break before we go on to the next item? A couple of nods around the screen. So if we have, say, a 5-minute break, if people can be back at, say, 7:45, we'll kick off then. Thank you.
Right.
Yep, all good. All right, welcome back, councillors. We'll resume the workshop discussion. So the next item is in relation to CEO and councillor remuneration levels. What I'll do, I just want to say a couple of words up front, and then I'll hand over to Kathy to talk us through this one. Sorry, Kathy, I can just get you to mute temporarily, please. So just wanted to, I suppose, introduce this subject matter, and in doing so, note that we've received the Tribunal's consideration in relation to this setting or the establishment of CEO remuneration levels. So just reminding councillors that with the changes to the local government legislation, council CEO remuneration levels will be set or pegged, and bands will be determined, or ranges of remuneration levels will be determined by the Remuneration Tribunal, and then within the maximum and minimum amounts determined by the Remuneration Tribunal, each council can then determine what the remuneration level is for their respective chief executive officers. Because it's the first year that this legislation is coming into effect, it will be the first time that the Remuneration Tribunal will give consideration to what the remuneration bands or minimum and maximum should be for different councils in our state. And so we believe it's prudent and appropriate that council should make some commentary in relation to that matter, given that it's the first time that the Remuneration Tribunal will do that. It is anticipated, but not yet confirmed, that the Remuneration Tribunal is likely to probably use banding similar to what is used for the determination of elected member allowances. So depending on the category of council, that will determine what sort of bands the council is in, and consequently what the minimum maximum levels are for the CEO's remuneration. And as is the case with council's allowances, our Remuneration Tribunal every year revisits the allowance, every 4 years revisits the allowance payable. So in this case, the tribunal will make a determination as to what the allowances will be following the next periodic election. And then it's, unless they make a change, it will then be indexed by CPI over the next 4 years. Before we get into the discussion about CEO and councillor remuneration and allowances respectively, the longer term and bigger picture for this conversation I wanted to set up front, and that is around how do we start to try, if at all, to address some of the inherent challenges that we have as a state, where we are currently and have been a city state. So once you get outside of Metro Adelaide, the sizes of the regional cities and the regional and remote and rural local government areas are very, very small, particularly in comparison with other states. So if you think about any other state, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland are the good ones all on the west eastern coast. Outside of the capital city, each of those states have got regional cities of size, scale, and importance in terms of supporting people living in those states. And whereas in South Australia, leaving Mount Murray Bridge aside, Mount Barker is the largest city outside of Metro Adelaide at 27,000, and Whyalla is the second largest city at 21,000. So the bigger frame conversation is how do we start to redress that situation in South Australia if it needs to be redressed, and what conversations do we have with both the federal government and the state government to try and potentially look at providing additional investment and funding into regional cities to support redressing that fundamental challenge that we have as a state. Through this discussion, councillors might say, well, that's just the way it is, and we're wasting our time, or we're not interested, in which case that's fine. But that I just wanted to set that big picture as a starting point. Again, behind the scenes and subject to the discussion tonight, we have started to develop conceptually a motion that we could put forward to ALGA in due course, looking at trying to support the federal government's regionalisation agenda and the investment into regional cities and what that might mean for Whyalla. Again, tonight's discussion will help inform that. So with that sort of introduction, sort of a bit long-winded, but I am mindful that this can be seen as self-interest and potentially biased in terms of self-interest, but it really is that longer-term frame that I've got in mind in terms of how we position this conversation going forward. So I'll hand over now to Kathy to walk us through some of the detail and then open up for discussion. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Justin. So this is a brief presentation to give some background information in the first instance, but there's two key questions that we're going to be looked to answer. And one is around the submission to the Remuneration Tribunal in terms of council member allowances. Sorry? Apologies, everybody. I've got quite a bit of feedback happening in here where I'm sitting. I will turn my onto mute and it will come through. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Great. Perfect. Thank you. That's not okay. So as I said, two primary questions. The first question will be in terms of whether council is disposed to make a submission to the Remuneration Tribunal in terms of council member allowances, and if council is disposed to do that, some parameters or some key parameters that you would like raised in that submission, following which we will prepare that and bring that to council for endorsement. And then the second question is regarding submission to the tribunal in terms of Chief Executive Officer remuneration. Prior to this meeting, I did circulate some work that has been done on that submission already. And if council again feels disposed that it wishes to make a submission to the tribunal in that regard, then we can proceed down that path. Then, if you concur with the basic parameters that we've outlined in what I've circulated previously. But I just wanted to go through some preliminary information in the first instance. In terms of elected member allowances, why hasn't that gone and changed on rules? There we go. Sorry. In terms of elected member allowances, the Local Government Act actually identifies that council members are entitled to an allowance as determined by the Remuneration Tribunal. Justin's already mentioned that determinations are made every 4 years prior to a periodic election to take account or to take effect after the next periodic election. Council members may elect not to take an allowance if they don't wish to take it. Allowances are considered a fee for the purposes of income tax, and they are taxable, but they are not taxed as PAYG, that is, they're not taxed through council, for example. The council member must declare their allowances at taxation time when they're completing their taxation returns. The only way that could actually come through PAYG is if council passed a resolution to be treated as an eligible local government body. And then through the Tax Administration Act, it is possible then that if there is a unanimous decision along those lines, that it could be counted as PAYG. However, this council has never done or taken or made such a resolution, according to our research, nor has any other council, to our knowledge, in South Australia taken this approach, and it's certainly not something that we actually recommend being taken. It has implications for superannuation, and it has implications for other practices, so it's not something that we do recommend occurs. In terms of the current allowances for council members, the Remuneration Tribunal has taken the approach whereby it places councils into different groups and then sets for each of those groups the council member allowances. I'll show you in a minute as to who each of the groups are, but Whyalla Council is in Group 2 at the moment. And as you can see there, they're the allowances that were set at the beginning of this term of council, and those allowances have been indexed over the last 4 years by CPI. So these amounts per annum are not what you're receiving today because they have been indexed, but this was the original allowance 4 years ago. In Group 2, the current councils are, as you can see, those on the screen, of which City of Whyalla is one of those. Now, in the research that we've done, these groupings are very much on the basis of various metrics such as population, such as gross regional product, such as numbers of electors, revenue, expenditure, etc. And it's pretty consistent right the way through. These now are the other groupings which are in there. As you can see, groups 1A and 1B comprise of the large metropolitan councils. City of Adelaide is outside of these parameters, and they have their own determination under the Remuneration Tribunal. And then groups 3, 4 and 5 move progressively down into the smaller councils across the state. In terms of the way the allowances are determined, so the Remuneration Tribunal determines council members' allowances, and then following that, the principal members receive an allowance that is 4 times that of a councillor. A deputy mayor receives 1.25 times of that of a councillor. The chair, if they are a council member of a prescribed committee, so for example, if the chair the audit committee was a council member, they would receive 1.25 times the annual allowance for councillors. And as we know, the allowances are increased by CPI each year. I'm going to pause there. Is there any questions from members in terms of the parameters of the current allowance regime and how it's calculated? No, no questions?
No.
Thank you. Just moving on to CEO remuneration now, and then we'll come to the actual discussion. As Justin mentioned, the CEO remuneration is within the new provisions of the Local Government Act brought in through the reform program. The remuneration is still to be determined by the council, but within bands set by the tribunal. And it is possible that the tribunal will, establish groupings similar to what is already established for the council members, and that will be used as a guide. We don't know that yet, but it stands to reason that that is a possible approach that they will take. But of course, they will set minimum and maximum remuneration that then the council can work within in terms of setting the CEO remuneration. As I mentioned before, the bands that are currently in place for council allowances are about right in the terms of population, revenue, geographic size, electors, gross regional product, but they probably don't adequately account for regional considerations, in terms of the complexity of, say, a CEO role or a mayoral role or a councillor role of the city of Whyalla, the complexity of that role versus the complexity of the role for the CEO of Norwood, Payneham, St Peters, for example, is quite different. In any given one day, the Chief Executive Officer of Whyalla Council, I'm giving Whyalla as an example because that's our experience, the Chief Executive Officer and the Mayor could be talking with the Premier, the Treasurer, very significant international business people, Chief Executive Officers of state departments, in one moment, and then in the next moment talking to a resident about dogs on and off-leash areas or, some other matter which is, in and around the community. And so, there's a lot of complexities in a regional area that don't exist in many other councils. What in terms of doing some research around this, Western Australia has adopted a tribunal setting bands for Chief Executive Officer remuneration for many years now. And the model in Western Australia, anecdotally and from feedback that has been received, is that it's quite well accepted in Western Australia. And the way that the Western Australian model handles the regional considerations and the differences is that it sets bands to groupings of councils, but it also then applies an allowance that can be provided by the resolution of the council to remunerations of regional councils. But those allowances do get reviewed by the Remuneration Tribunal to ensure that those allowances are being set within a framework, so that you're still getting the independent review and independent view in terms of those allowances. And so that seems to be a model which is received and getting good feedback from participants in Western Australia. And so I'm going to pause there and open it up for discussion. I guess firstly the question is, does council wish to make... No, I won't. I'll come to that question secondly. Is the Group 2 the right grouping for council in terms of council member allowances and so on? Where is and what are council's views on that? Anybody got any comments? You want to put your hand up on that? Councillor Marshall?
Well, just after that discussion where you're talking about what a CEO in a regional council such as Whyalla has to deal with, then that trickles down the line to both administration and elected member bodies and the mayor. So it just follows suit that if we look at the complexity of a council such as Whyalla, therefore we should not just be using the CEO's remuneration in isolation, because it really is part of the whole group, both staff and elected members. So whether it's the right grouping or not, I think the WA model is a good model, and perhaps maybe the groupings, if we're making a submission, perhaps it's that is the submission, to group them based on a different set of elements than what they currently are.
Yeah.
Councillor Stone.
Councillor Stone.
Yes, I'd agree with those comments of Councillor Joes there. I would still agree that the grouping as it is the right grouping for us. My main comment would relate to the mayor. In days gone by, the mayors did not do anywhere near what's expected of a good mayor these days. And if you look at the way Whyalla's grown over the years, if the mayor is doing the job that's required, it's almost a full-time job. All you've got to do is look at our mayor's monthly list of activities, and the mayor anywhere is called on outside of council to attend so many other functions. So I think from my point of view, it's important to look at the mayor's level. As far as the deputy mayor or elected members, I think what we get reimbursed is adequate. I certainly, in either role, would not be looking for increases there. And in this day and age, I think while we all put in the time for a range of reasons and the remuneration is justified, I certainly wouldn't want to see it just going up and up. So personally, I believe our level is fine. I would like to see the mayor's level reviewed.
Thank you, Councillor Stone. Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, in line with what Councillor Marshall and Councillor Stoner said, I agree entirely, particularly in the fact that the mayor and the elected members' allowances should be separate. The mayor, as Phil said, is such an important person these days and does such a wide-ranging job. Their remuneration should be looked at separately altogether.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I'll speak to this in regards to a bigger area. In regards to regional councils, I would speak on, especially in the Eyre Peninsula, around the amount of not me, but I'm talking about other smaller councils who have a very varied workload compared to perhaps to city councils, and often the workload is almost full time as well, but proportional to their size councils, their remuneration may not be quite perhaps where some of the mayors would like it to be. I guess it's not about perhaps on costing that to a council, especially if they're a smaller council, that their revenue levels aren't high. So maybe it's something that maybe needs to go to another body for remuneration to make it balanced and fair. Just because you're a small council and you don't have a huge rate revenue, but the workload and the amount of work that goes into keeping their city or their town operational and obviously growing, I think needs more recognition. Based on interstate models, interstate councils. If you go to any other councils on the East Coast or wherever, their levels of remuneration quite unbalanced, you know, much higher than ours, you know. Anyhow, this is a conversation that's going to go to for the state, and that's why we've been asked to be part of this discussion and debate. And I think it's really good, the feedback that we're giving. Just remember, this is all part of a state picture. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you, Claire. Councillor Stupos.
Always controversial, I am. As you probably know, when this issue came up last time, I actually wanted a higher rate to be paid to the CEO. I still maintain that, given the duties that the poor gentleman's covering. He's not doing the same duties as probably a Group 1 CEO in Norwood, St Peters, Payneham, etc. I mean, you know, Justin's dealing with big corporations, international people. He's trying to attract businesses into this town. It kind of takes an intellectual capacity that maybe those mayors don't have, and they're not likely to attract those sorts of businesses into their already congested council areas. So I think there's got to be some sort of compensation for his duties and skills in that area. So yeah, I was in favour of a higher rate, but got voted down. And I also accept that the council may or may not afford it. But the trouble is, if you're going to put these people under that much stress and the salary is low, you're not going to attract the right capable person for that job. So yeah, it's kind of the devil you know and the devil you don't know. Yeah, I think you need to make certain that the salary is struck at the right accord. And that's all.
Thank you, Councillor Stupos. Any further comments? No? Okay. So I guess the question, what I'm hearing is that yes, we will make a submission into both of the questions, firstly around the council member remuneration, and include in that submission a proposition around the mayor, acknowledging you know, the complexity of the mayor's role in today's councils, and in particular in you know, for this particular region, but also broaden and expand that in terms of acknowledging the mayors of regional councils you know, have a you know, the complexity of the role that does not necessarily get reflected in the size of their council. And then in terms of remuneration, Chief Executive Officer remuneration, that council is in general concurring with the Western Australian model in terms of bands for the setting of the Chief Executive Officer remuneration, but then the ability to pay an allowance on top of that from an attraction retention point of view, given the complexities around a regional location. And as Justin mentioned at the beginning of this this topic, that the positioning of the regional argument also needs to be in the context of structural change from a state perspective, you know, as to you know, the investment in regionalisation and in regional cities to ensure that you know, the whole of the state is actually that the whole of the state is actually catered for, rather than it being, you know, just a city-state scenario as it speaks. So, is that basically a representation of where council feels with this? Yep. And I see nods and hands. Yep. Okay.
Bill wants to talk.
Bill, did you want to make any comments, or?
I do. I do believe that the allowance that the council receives now is adequate. I don't think we should group in with the conversation. I think it's to do with the mayor's reimbursement and the CEO's, nothing to do with the council.
Okay. I will frame a submission along those lines if people are in agreement. Councillor Knox.
Just going to say everything's old is new again. We're going to, one of the things that's been raised is a regional isolation allowance for CEOs. We did that some time ago for all of our council employees. If they stayed with the council for a year, they got so much money, 2 years, they got so much more, and so on. And we got rid of it. And I think that if we introduce it for CEOs, then we have to look at it across the board, not just for the CEOs.
I think that this, the difference with this, and I mean, certainly in terms of attraction and retention and remuneration and so on throughout the whole of the organisation, is something that is looked at when recruitment occurs. In this case, this is remuneration which is being and going to be set within bands in terms of the Remuneration Tribunal. And so this would be introducing a system at a state level and not just at an individual council level. The other part of, and I'll just share the other part of the Western Australian system, is that an allowance, if it is actually provided for by the Remuneration Tribunal, is still something that the council itself has the ability to set or not set. And so, you know, the choice is still with the council as to whether or not it wants to avail itself of that allowance as an attraction retention opportunity. So yes, acknowledge your comment, Councillor Knox, and recognise that certainly as recruitment occurs here within the organisation, attraction retention is considered as part of the setting of remuneration and as part of the recruitment process. Okay, given the time and so on, next steps for this is that we will present and prepare a submission to go for the Council Allowances Remuneration Tribunal, and the draft CEO remuneration submission. We will basically proposition Council's support for the WA model moving forward, and we'll present a final copy of that submission to the Chief Executive Officer Review Panel for review and agreement for submission. The closing date for submissions on that particular item is the 8th of March, so that's next week. So we'll finalise that submission, distribute it around to Council, but also submit it to the Review Panel's meeting, which is occurring this Wednesday morning, to ensure that we've got that, that go-ahead from the panel. Unless there's any final comments, that's it from me for this item. No? Okay.
All right.
Back to you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kathy. All right, well, that concludes tonight's workshop. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. We'll close the meeting now at 8:17, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday of next week. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Good night.
Bye.